The little colony of New South Wales was growing fast, and pretty soon the need to establish law and order was paramount. But that raised a bit of a conundrum. How do you punish someone who's already being punished in a penal colony? This little stone fort, smack bang in the middle of Sydney Harbour, used to be called Pinchgut Island. It's a tourist attraction now, but it's got a really sinister past. Crimes began to be committed almost as soon as the first convicts arrived here, but there weren't any walls or fortifications to lock them up in. What there was this place. Offenders were banished in chains to this nearby island, surrounded by shark-infested waters. From the start, the jailers were outnumbered by the convicts. If things got out of hand, reinforcements could be months away. A terrifying prospect. Admittedly, lots of convicts were little more than pickpockets, but there were also those who were bad to the bone. In 1796, a man called Francis Morgan was sent here for execution as a dreadful and awful example to others, as they said at the time. He'd already committed a murder back in Ireland, which was why he was transported here. But 3 years later, he bashed to death a man called Simon Raven over there on the northern shore. Before the hangman placed the rope over Morgan's head, he was asked for his final words. He's said to have replied nonchalantly, "Death is a morbid subject, and I've no desire to confess my sins. The only thing worth mentioning is the superb view of the harbour I have up here. I'm sure there are no waters in the world that compare with it for beauty." What a strange man he was. Morgan's body was then tarred and hung from the gibbet post. A grim reminder of what happens to those who flaunt authority. They let him swing there for 4 years. Today, the island in the harbour is a posh little restaurant, which is kind of ironic, because back when it was known as Matawanya, it was a place where all the local tribes could meet, fish, and exchange news in peace. But that tradition ended the day Morgan was strung up. How would they feel, do you think, when they saw Francis hanging up?
Aboriginal people were just so horrified by the situation, they would steer well clear of the island, and it's so unlike any types of act that we've seen before.
Weren't they used to that type of punishment?
Definitely not. Our punishments, for an example, would be to shun them from the community. So they were disowned. That was the biggest shame, not cut the life short and make an example out of that human being, out of that living spirit.
When the Third Fleet arrived in 1791, it included a ship full of Irish. And this lot had no intention of succumbing to the rule of British law. The Irish hated the British for colonising their country. The British, in turn, looked down their noses at the Irish as being ignorant for believing in fairies and leprechauns. Back then, there was an idea doing the rounds that the great nation of China was inland just over the mountains. A lot of people believed it, including a number of the Irish. 21 of them made a break for freedom. They all set off to the north. There were 20 blokes and one heavily pregnant woman. But the whole thing was a disaster. They walked for 3 days, during which time one of the men was speared to death by an Aboriginal, another one got heat exhaustion and died, and all the rest of them got lost. They all split up. They were blundering all over the place. And of course, a search party was sent out, and eventually they were all captured, tired, exhausted, and naked. But the irony is that the first one to be caught, who was the heavily pregnant woman, ended up nearer to Sydney than she was 3 days previously when she'd started out. "1798 is an infamous year for Irish Republicans. It's the year that the Battle at Vinegar Hill took place over in Ireland. Could I have 3 pints of Guinness, please? Thousands of Irish rebels gathered on the hillside, most armed with nothing more than a steel pike to take on the might of the British Army. A massacre ensued, and those who survived were exiled to the other side of the world. So from about the year 1800, the little colony of New South Wales started to fill up with Irish convicts who didn't think of themselves as convicts. They saw themselves as political prisoners, and they loathed the British. And as soon as they got here, they started to organise an uprising. 6 times in 2 years they tried, and each time they failed. Often it was an informant who gave the game away in exchange for a measure of rum. But not everyone could be bought. Here's an eyewitness account of an attempt to get information from 16-year-old Paddy Galvin. He was ordered to get 300 lashes. He got 100 on the back, and you could see his backbone between the shoulder blades. Then the doctor ordered him to get another 100 on his bottom. He got it, and then his haunches were in such a jelly that the doctor ordered him to be flogged on the calves of his legs. He got 100 there, and as much as a whimper, he never gave. They asked him if he would tell where the pikes were hid. He said he didn't know and wouldn't tell. "You may as well hang me now," he said, "for you'll never get any music from me." They put him in the cart and took him to the hospital. By March 1804, they were ready to try again. Most were Irish, but many English convicts also swore allegiance to the cause. In Philip Cunningham, they had a leader who knew how to organise troops and rally a force. This time, they'd managed to keep the plot a secret. So when 200 of them escaped from Castle Hill, it caught the Redcoats completely by surprise. Major Johnson, leader of the Redcoats, marched 29 soldiers through the night from Sydney. By dawn, they'd caught up with the rebels on a hill outside Parramatta. The army was outnumbered almost 10 to 1. When the Redcoats and the rebels finally met up, there was a big standoff. Would you mind being our Redcoats?
Yeah, no worries.
Sorry to disturb you when you're working. You just line up there, OK? You're Major Johnson, who was the leader of the Redcoats, right? And guys, would you be the rebels for us? OK, you're Philip Cunningham, who was the leader of the rebels, and you're going, "Calm down, everybody, calm down, calm down." And Cunningham, you're going, "Death or liberty?" And you're going, "I want a boat back home, I want a boat back home." And the tension is absolutely, you could cut it with a knife, except that it's a trick as far as Johnson's concerned, because he just sneaks a gun out of his pocket and he points it at one of the rebels, and at the same moment, one of his men points his gun at Cunningham, and I don't know what happens next, except it all kicks off and suddenly they're all firing at each other. Fire at him! You're firing at him. Oh, God. This is a lovely little caricature of what took place that day at Vinegar Hill. That's one of the rebels shouting, "Death or liberty," and this is Johnson shouting, "You scoundrel, I'll liberate you." 9 rebels were killed, a lot more were injured, including Cunningham, although everybody thought he was dead because he'd been run through by a sword, and the rebels thought, we've lost our leader, and ran away. But in fact, Cunningham was still alive, and the redcoats dragged him off to the government store, and next day they hanged him from the staircase of the store without trial. And they hanged an awful lot of the rest of the rebels, and they just left them dangling there as a gruesome reminder of what death or liberty really meant. What do you think Johnson would think if he knew he'd been buried in the same graveyard as a lot of revolting Catholics?
I think Major Johnson would be spinning in his grave if he had any idea that this was the outcome.
Was everyone who was involved in the uprising Irish?
No, about half of them were English, and they just sort of joined along in the general fun. Samuel Marsden, who was the person in charge of the trials, was absolutely horrified to discover that 4 of the 8 that were going to be hanged had to have their last rites, so to speak, from the Church of England rather than the Catholic faith. And he got around this by saying that his poor, wayward Protestant sheep had been drawn into this most unhappy affair by the wickedness of the Irish Catholics.
Why were the Irish so rebellious?
Well, they were people without many civil and human rights back in Ireland, which became worse when they were transported here, because Ireland was in such a state of constant turmoil at that period that they were tried with no record kept of their sentences. So they could have come for 7 years, 14 years or life. Now, when they learned that they were here forever, that's when they started to really step up their attempts to escape. And all they ever wanted to do was get away, get on a ship and go home to Ireland.
With the Irish dissidents still swinging from the trees, the authorities began making sure this couldn't happen again. They'd build a place for the worst of the worst, the rebellious and the repeat offenders. With the strictest security yet devised, it would be inescapable. Port Arthur today is as pretty as a postcard. It's a major tourist attraction in Tasmania. And looking at it from here, it's difficult to imagine it was once one of the most terrifying places on Earth. They say that once you got to Port Arthur, you couldn't leave, which was why when it was established here in 1830 as a penal settlement, it was where they put the lowest of the low, the worst criminals and the incorrigibles, or the double damned, those who'd already committed crimes after they'd arrived in the penal colonies. Location was always part of its appeal, but not for the picturesque surroundings. Port Arthur is a natural fortress, accessible only via a narrow strip of land known as Eagle Hawk Neck. In its days as the most inescapable prison on Earth, the entrance was protected by vicious attack dogs tethered across the entrance like wild demons guarding the gates of hell. When you first got here as a convict, you'd be put on really heavy back-breaking work like felling and transporting trees. Although, if you were good, then you'd be taken off that quite quickly and be trained up in a skill like being a sawyer or a servant. If you were bad, though, then you went back on the heavy work, except this time you had to wear these leg irons, which are an absolute nightmare. They chafe you round there. They're so heavy that walking in them is very difficult. But the worst thing is these rivets here, which mean you can't get them off. You're stuck in them 24 hours a day. In fact, they even had to wear special trousers with buttons in them to be able to get their trousers off. But humans being what they are, some of the convicts got rather proud of them. They thought of them as a badge of honour and started polishing them up like a bit of prison bling. The other crazy thing about them was that they had to do coordinated lifting. A whole line of them would lift a tree trunk like that. And when they walked along doing this, they were known as the centipede gang. Van Diemen's Land, as the island was known back then, was truly the end of the earth from a European perspective. Some of the worst atrocities committed in colonial Australia happened here. I suspect in large part because of its remoteness. The indigenous people of Tasmania were virtually wiped out in a generation. The most chilling story is about a bushranger called James Carrot, who murdered the Aboriginal husband of a woman that he was using for his own purposes, and then forced her to wear the man's head round her neck as a warning to others that he was not a man to be messed with. Of course, not everyone who called Port Arthur home was a violent psychopath. In the case of Billy Hunt, nothing could be further from the truth. Billy Hunt was transported to Van Diemen's Land in the year 1825. He'd been convicted of stealing a handkerchief, which may not sound much, but in those days, handkerchiefs were the must-have fashion item for young gentlemen who used to wear them dangling out of their pockets. And of course, they kept getting nicked. So the law decided to throw its full weight at handkerchief thieves, and he was sentenced to 14 years transportation for stealing one hanky, which seems to me pretty severe even by the standards of those days. But the thing about Billy was that he was a complete nutter in the most charming way. When he got here, he was put in a lunatic asylum, he escaped, and eventually ended up here in Port Arthur. But when he escaped from here, it was the great escape. Steve McQueen couldn't have bettered it. He put on a kangaroo skin and bounded out of Port Arthur. And the story goes that there were these two guards who saw this kangaroo coming towards them, and they were fed up with prison rations and rather fancied kangaroo stew. So they got out their muskets, pointed them at this kangaroo that stuck its hands up in the air and shouted, "Don't shoot, it's only Billy Hunt." What sentence did he get for the kangaroo stunt?
Well, they gave him 100 lashes, which is the maximum flogging that you could legally award. But interestingly, afterwards they charged him again. They charged him with protesting that he hadn't actually been apprehended, that he'd surrendered at Eagle Hawk Neck, which makes me think that the story is in fact true, that he had stuck his hands up in the air.
He was one of these blokes who just couldn't stay out of trouble, isn't he?
Well, absolutely, and you see his offence record just carries on at Port Arthur. There's a whole heap of little offences. He was done for having a forged shilling in his possession and trying to traffic with it, and he spent a month in solitary confinement. for that on Bread and Water. And he was discovered under the blankets with George Burroughs.
Does that mean what I think it means?
I think it almost certainly does, Tony. And in fact, over the course of his sentence, he clocked up an amazing 1,800 days in leg irons, 625 lashes, and 135 days in solitary confinement.
He was a nutter.
I think undoubtedly. You know, that's one of the sad things about a place like this, is that you tend to think that everybody who comes here is bad, but in fact, you know, in his case, he may have been bad, but he was also certainly mad.
Do we know what happened to him in the end?
Yes, he was sent from Port Arthur to a lunatic asylum, so a building rather like this one. This wasn't built when he was at Port Arthur, but he was sent to an institution rather like this one at a place called New Norfolk.
Poor old Billy. And if physical brutality wasn't enough, the authorities were keen to pioneer an altogether more sinister punishment. They hoped redemption could be earned through isolation and the solitary contemplation of one's sins. So who was sent here?
Everybody. Everybody who was sent to Port Arthur from the late 1840s onwards spent a period of time in here.
And what went on here?
Well, frighteningly, not a lot.
Cool, I can see how you could have kept people in control here. All you need to do is sit down here. You can see up there, and over there, behind me.
Absolutely. Welcome to Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon. So, Panopticon, all-seeing prison.
So did you never talk to anybody else?
You only talked to your guards. And the whole idea is that to cut off all communication with their fellow convicts, and so that they would reflect on the error of their ways and what they had done.
It sounds much more scientific.
Absolutely. And it's actually called scientific penal theory. So the idea was that transportation was barbaric, it was old-fashioned, but this is a new way of getting to the mind of the prisoner.
Yeah, because before you just beat people up and
That's right,
whip
absolutely.
them, and now you're doing their heads in.
Okay, yep. And the idea is that it's that psychological emphasis that will result in long-term reform, to actually throw the whole thing onto a reflection of where you had gone wrong.
You know what it reminds me of? Guantanamo Bay.
I think that's the roots of all of that. And prisoners died. I mean, the death rates in buildings like this were much higher than the death rates outside with the hard labour carrying logs and the flogging and all the rest of it. It's really terrifying. Ah! Precisely.
Whenever a prisoner left his cell, he had to wear his face mask. Whenever he broke a rule, he was confined to the punishment cell. They say you could have screamed for days without being heard.
It is so dark in here.
I don't actually see why I need to wear a hat anymore. It doesn't make any difference. You can hear every tiny little noise from a long way off. I'm getting near my tummy rumbling. These boots are killing my feet. I'm going to do something really exciting now. A bit of a sit. You do really start going into yourself. I imagine you could get quite irritated when somebody opened the door and said you've got to go outside and exercise. You'd be just so locked in your head.
Can you hear that, Daddy?
that it?
Yeah, you can come out now.
It's so funny, I can't be bothered to get up. What makes you really... dozy. It's not something I'd recommend. It's the truth.
What was it like?
You know what strikes me most? I'm speaking so quietly, aren't I? I never speak like this normally. What strikes me most is that it's a brilliant form of punishment because nobody's actually punishing you. All you did was chuck me in a dark room. The punishment is just self-inflicted. It's all those anxieties and paranoias and doubts and feelings of lack of self-worth and all that. Well, I don't think I'm particularly messed up, but all that stuff does come to the fore, and you I suppose over a long period you either learn to deal with that and survive, or if you don't learn to deal with it, it would be absolute torture. It really would be like your head was completely haunted by the worst visions in the world.
It's really, really quite terrifying. And one of the things that I find really, really awful about it is that there's no way of resisting.
So it could cure you in a funny sort of way, couldn't it? It could give you a robustness, I suppose. I suppose that's the logic anyway.
Or send you mad.
Yeah. In my case, it's just sent me very quiet. Oh, I'll be glad to get these boots off. But there was one place in the separate prison where you could express yourself. A place where everything and nothing was sacred. Where do I go?
Down the steps, Tony,
Yeah.
to aisle D.
Oh, here we are, D.
Yep. In you go, Tony. So
Through
open
here?
that. Yes, open that door.
It's a bit of a squeeze, isn't it?
Now close it in. So this closes like that. And I'm going to close myself in. And there we go.
So I still can't see my fellow prisoners.
But you can take your mask off now. So that means that you can see the chaplain.
Thank you very much.
Well, it's the only person that you're allowed to see. And so it'll encourage you to reform your wicked ways.
Couldn't really muck about in here, could you?
Well, we've got prisoners charged with offences, and there's one that I absolutely adore. There was a guy who was charged with pulling faces, sticking his tongue out, and leering at the chaplain. When he was tried for this, he said, "I admit to all of it, but I did not stick my tongue out."
It's a bit like choir boys, isn't it? I think just about the only act of defiance I can think of is weeing on the floor.
Yes, that's right.
But it would be one of the few things you could do, wouldn't it?
Yes, I'm sure it was done.
You could spend all the time you're being lectured, you could have your willy out. As a place of punishment, Port Arthur had no equal. But as it turns out, it wasn't the prisoners the authorities needed to fear, nor was it the Irish dissidents. The greatest challenge to their authority would come from much closer to home. Put yourself in the shoes of the British authorities. The penal colony you've created more than 17,000 kilometres from home is getting off the ground. But the convicts now vastly outnumber their guards. So you'd imagine you'd want a strong military presence of Britain's finest to keep things in check. You'd think that, but you'd be wrong. As more and more convicts poured into New South Wales, its rulers felt themselves increasingly vulnerable. They knew that they had to rely on the army, but this wasn't the cream of Britain's redcoats. This was a bunch of blokes without prospects, recruited from Britain's poor and unemployed. And they were all too eager to exploit the powerful situation that they now found themselves in. And they did so by using a substance they were already pretty familiar with. Virtually indistinguishable from the convicts except for their red coats, they soon became known as the Rum Corps, the most powerful and unscrupulous group in the colony by far. The redcoats cornered the market in this stuff, rum, although actually the word rum was a catch-all phrase for virtually any strong liquor. They didn't just use it in order to get hammered, though. As far as they were concerned, it was a bona fide currency. The wages for the construction of some of the most famous buildings in Sydney were paid in rum. The wanted posters for the capture of bushrangers advertised the reward in rum. There's even a story that one bloke sold his wife for 4 gallons of the stuff. And it was absolutely disgusting. How did rum come to be the currency? Well, it's a story that goes back to the very beginning of the colony. When Governor Arthur Phillips suddenly returned to England in poor health, he left a power vacuum that the officers of the Corps were quick to exploit. Out went Phillips' instruction that soldiers and convicts should receive the same food ration. Out went collective farms. In came massive land grants to fellow officers. It wasn't long before the Rum Corps officers grew rich, and no one grew richer faster than John MacArthur, owner of the best farming land in the colony and the de facto leader of the Rum Corps. MacArthur had a reputation for being willful and cantankerous, but in the new governor, he finally met his match. His name was William Bligh, already famous all over the empire for having survived the mutiny on the Bounty. What would it have been like when these two came face to face? A clash of the titans? Well, for more than a year, it was actually more like a chess game. OK, so this is Bligh.
This is Bligh.
What was he like?
Oh, Bligh was a stolid man. He was a stickler for the rules. Not particularly imaginative, but certainly someone who took orders but also expected others to obey them.
And what about our chap over here? The king of the troops, who's this?
Well, this is John MacArthur.
Yep.
He was manipulative, he had great moments of depression and other great moments of elation. He had periods when he had a lot of energy. He was always on the move, but then other times when he had no energy.
The word bipolar springs to my mind.
Well, I think that some people now do consider that he was, in fact, bipolar.
So when Bligh arrived, he was tasked to clear up this rum racket.
Bligh's instructions were to break up the rum trade and, of course, to break up the power of the New South Wales Corps, who had made a lot of money in the colony, and to re-establish the rule of the governor. The New South Wales Corps were basically made up of British unemployed who could not get jobs in Britain and would have been nothing. But out here, and particularly officers, they were somebodies.
So what did MacArthur decide to do?
Well, MacArthur was very concerned because Bligh had threatened his land grant, which was the basis of his empire. And so MacArthur tried to exert his authority over Bligh to see who was preeminent.
Were there any similarities between the two men?
There's one thing that unites them, one thing that they share, and that is that when they believe they are right, which is most of the time, they are immovable.
It all came to a head on the 26th of January 1808, 20 years to the day after the colony was founded. The date was no coincidence. MacArthur had managed to convince the Rum Corps that their lifestyle was at stake. The army was ready to depose their boss, the King's representative, and create an entirely new government. In the heat of the day, 400 of them marched the short distance to Government House to arrest the governor. Bligh must have been furious. After all, this was the second time he'd been the subject of a mutiny. The half-drunk soldiers searched high and low, and finally found him hiding under a bed. This is Australia's first political cartoon. It was created within hours of the mutiny and was intended to ridicule Bligh. But does it actually capture what happened? It's not great art, is it?
No, it's not, Tony. It's a fairly ordinary drawing. It's a pretty lousy draftsmanship, but your eye follows the drawing very neatly, and of course, Bligh is the focus. One of the key parts of this is this dramatic pose by this trooper who's leaning down.
It is odd to me, though, that the tyrant of the bounty would have been found under a bed.
Well, that is the argument, isn't it? I mean, I think he was in the Royal Navy from the age of 7 or something like that, and he'd already had one mutiny under his belt, so I don't blame him for cowering under the bed, if indeed he did, but this...
You say if indeed he did, you think he might not have?
I think he probably didn't. I think he was a pretty tough fellow. I mean, he's a hard, old-time Navy man. He'd be fairly fearless. But the troopers hold the key. They are drawn as the great guardians of society. They're like grenadier guards. They're magnificently poised.
So in real life, you don't think that the troopers would have looked like that?
No, they're mutineers. They were Rum Corps troopers. They would have been rum-soaked and pretty rough around the edges, and it says so much so people would believe that Bligh was found cowering under the bed with his chamber pot.
So how would you have drawn it differently?
Well, I'd have started with the troopers, OK? Say Bligh was under the bed. The way I'd go about drawing the troopers, I'd draw them like a proper rum rebellion mutineer, and they'd be dishevelled, you know, they'd be a bit fly-blown, and, you know, they'd be pretty rough around the edges. Don't forget, these guys are using rum as currency. They wouldn't have the fine grenadier guard look about them. And I'd have this guy reaching down, grabbing Bligh by the throat, superimpose this bloke on top of this trooper. You'd have a completely different image. You know, here's Bligh and he's being monstered by these mutineers.
Suddenly, you feel quite sorry for Bligh now, don't you?
Yeah, poor old Governor Bligh.
So what became of the players in Australia's only military coup? When this whole incident was over, MacArthur wrote to his wife Elizabeth, "The tyrant is even now, no doubt, gnashing his teeth in vexation at his overthrow." But of course, that kind of overthrow is never permanent, is it? A couple of years later, Bligh was back in England, where he was exonerated, promoted, and by all accounts lived a long and happy life in the bosom of his family. MacArthur? Well, he was forced to live in exile for almost a decade, but as was his way, he turned adversity to advantage. Even before he arrived in England to attempt to clear his name, he'd sold the first bale of Australian merino wool. It achieved a record price and assured his fortune. But there's one more twist in the tale, and it can now be revealed on an archaeological dig. This is Camden Park in New South Wales, which once belonged to John and Elizabeth MacArthur. It's perhaps the most historically important farm in all Australia. A team of archaeologists are now uncovering some of the original buildings that housed the convict workers and possibly John MacArthur himself in his final unhappy years.
The thing that's interesting here, we do have the two-room cottage, fireplace in the end wall, partition wall, and then the second room. But what we've found in this excavation is, in fact, we've got two cottages joined side by side, which is much rarer and really does indicate that the Camden estate was a well-established property. They were building substantial structures to house their workers.
And really lovely views that the convicts would have had.
The best view. This land, as you know, was some of the best pasture land discovered in Australia up to that time. It's known as the cow pastures.
Why?
Because this is where they discovered the cattle that had escaped from the First Fleet landing in 1788. The cattle had sought out the best pasture. John MacArthur knew a thing or two, and this was the land that he wanted for his merino sheep.
It's a bizarre fact that while the First Fleet convicts struggled to eke out a living, the cows they brought with them prospered. It was nearly a decade before the runaway cattle were found. Can you imagine the surprise of the explorers when they emerged from a week bashing through impenetrable bush, only to discover a vast undulating pasture land already populated with a large herd of well-fed cattle? But this is more than a quirky little yarn. Those cows helped transform the colony in a most unexpected way. A few years after the pasture land was discovered, John MacArthur, who'd gone to England to face a court-martial for shooting his superior officer in a duel, no less, managed to convince the colonial secretary to give him title to all this land. And he used it to breed merino sheep. Yup, a gunfight and 6 runaway cows helped start the Australian wool industry. And the wool industry played a key role in making Australia the nation it is today. I just found out something really unexpected. I was looking at this local history book, which has got a list of all the convicts that they know about who were here. And I came across this bloke, William J. Parrott. What intrigued me was that my grandfather's name was Horace Parrott, and his dad was William Parrott, and his dad was Thomas William Parrott, and his dad was William Parrott, and so on and so forth. Lots of Thomas and William Parrotts right back to the beginning of the 19th century, which is as far back as we've been able to trace. But what got me really excited was that all my Parrotts lived around Shoreditch. And when I asked Ted if he knew where William was born, you said...
Shoreditch.
So this bloke could be a member of my family. But Ted, all this stuff is really quite obscure. Do you know what any of it means?
All right, well, it says he was a convict and he arrived in New South Wales in 1791 on the ship called the Albemarle. It doesn't tell us his sentence, but it does tell us what he did when he got it, which was a shoemaker.
And what's this? A lease on CP?
It probably means released on conditional pardon in 1807.
And then he received some land?
That's right. 3 years later, he had a land grant in 1810 at Narellan, which is just south of here, and so was a local man.
I'm really quite excited about this, thank you.
Well done.
Suddenly, it's not just the history of Australia, it's my family's history as well.
Well, that's right. One of your relatives survived the convict system. You should be proud of it.
I think I am. But what was a shoemaker doing working on a farm? Well, if you wanted goods or luxuries of any kind at this time, you had to make them. So skilled convicts, like William no doubt, were valuable assets to the wealthy. In the late 1820s, there'd have been around about 75 convicts working here. According to the 1828 census, these are some of the jobs that they would have done. Blacksmith, wool sorter, general servant, butter churner, milkmaid, and William Parrott shoemaker. The magic of television. Now, I have to confess, I've become just a little bit obsessed with William Parrott. so I'm making a quick detour to dig a little further at the State Library of New South Wales. This is all the stuff that they've pulled together for me about William Parrott. It's really exciting. Here he is, Parrott there, shoemaker. This is the daybook from the estate when he was a convict. And this is all the stuff that he bought and sold. Interesting thing here, 12 gallons of wine that he bought at 15 shillings a gallon. So there's something that runs in the family. This is the land that he eventually got. Doesn't look particularly big on this map, but later on when the village of Narellan starts to develop, you can see actually it's very big and it backs on to the whole village. This is a significant piece of property. He's obviously a major player in the village. And there's loads of other stuff, his indenture, clips from various newspapers and stuff, but the one that really excited me was the Old Bailey procedures from when he was originally busted. Look, it says here, William Parrott, committed to stand trial at the Old Bailey on the 8th of July 1789, charged with breaking and entering and stealing a quantity of silverware, the property of Samuel Brooks of Primrose Street, Bishopsgate. And Bishopsgate's only about a mile and a half from Shoreditch where he lived, so he hadn't gone very far. He was 21 years old and he stole 2 silver salt shakers, a spoon, 11 teaspoons, a pot of milk, 2 tablespoons, a cotton gown, and 1 silver milk pot. It was a tea set. He got convicted for stealing a tea set, total value about £3. He was found guilty and sentenced to death, but his sentence was then commuted to transportation for life. For nicking a few cups and saucers, a travesty of justice. Well, I suppose you could say it was a lucky break in a way. I wonder what's on his land these days. Now that would be worth finding out. I've come back out to William Parrott's old stomping ground. I haven't found his land yet, but after traipsing all over St John's Cemetery for a few hours, I've found his final resting place. I know that he moved here to Parramatta a few years after he bought the place in Narellan. I know that he worked for the government here, that he was a landowner, that he became a police constable and was paid £2 a week for the privilege. I don't know if he ever married or not, but he is recorded as having lived with a woman called Mary Smith at one time. And I know that when he died, aged 56, there must have been somebody who cared about him because they gave him a proper gravestone. I still don't know if he's a member of my family or not, but I am pleased to have found him. It really helps you understand what a tiny place the colony was in William's day when you see that his land grant was personally signed by Lachlan Macquarie, the man who replaced William Bligh as governor. Macquarie is often referred to as the father of Australia. He was the one who finally got the Rum Corps under control, and he was the first to use the word Australia in official correspondence. But there's more to him than that. Macquarie kick-started modern Australia. He oversaw the transition from what was basically a military prison run by hard-nosed Navy men to a more open society of ex-convicts and free settlers. One of his first acts was to issue land grants to emancipated convicts, and one of the first grants was William Parrott's. The land at Narellan, backing onto the village. It's a golf club, my family golf club. I own a golf club. Macquarie's other great legacy was his passion for exploration. His support for the early explorers set the scene for the great age of discovery that would soon sweep across the continent like wildfire. Next time, the sun-struck explorers push inland in search of God knows what.
The first thing he did was bite the head of the chief tent man.
They said the bushrangers are coming.
It just looked absolutely terrifying,
It would have been horrible.
And the discovery of gold was a game changer.
Society was transformed. Hi, I'm Tony Robinson. If you love my show and want to see some more amazing history stories, then please hit the subscribe button, click the notification bell, and we'll let you know when there's something new to watch. Enjoy.